Our session this morning is titled Biblical Perspectives on Peace and Justice. We start the day in this way to remember our teachings, to remember how we want to be shaped as justice-seeking people, to remember our place, to remember our calling. And we are grateful to have with us this morning Sheila Clausen-Weed, Associate Professor at Canadian Mennonite University. Sheila has been teaching the Bible for over 25 years and loves to make it come alive for students and congregations. She is currently writing the volume on James in the Believers Church Bible Commentary Series. She and her husband Vern have 3 young adult daughters and worship at Charleswood Mennonite Church in Winnipeg. When Sheila is not working at a CMU or getting presentations ready for MCC Saskatchewan, she finds joy in getting her hands dirty in the garden, running, making delectable desserts, reading novels, and spending time with family and friends. Sheila has been a personal friend of mine for many years. Some of our children have worked together at the CMU farm. Welcome to our circle, Sheila. You have our ears and our imaginations.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. It's really nice to be here. There are very few benefits of COVID, but one of them is that we can gather across the country like this virtually. And so it would still be nicer to be there in person with you, but this is pretty good. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint with my talk, so just give me a minute and I want to make sure this works. Can you all see that?
Yes, it looks good, Sheila.
Okay, and you can hear me okay? Okay, great. I'm just making sure I can advance the slides too. Okay. As I sat at my desk on September 30th, I thought this is an appropriate day to be working on a presentation for an MCC Peace and Justice Conference. For several years, Canadians have recognized September 30th as Orange Shirt Day, and this year that day officially became the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Thousands of people gathered across Canada to remember the tragic legacy of residential schools, to honor the courage and resilience of survivors, and to commit to the ongoing hard work of reconciliation. It's a day when the word justice was on many people's minds and hearts and lips. What do calls for justice mean in the context of Canada's injustices against Indigenous peoples? How do we as a church participate in that discussion or lead it? What would justice look like? These are questions that flitted through my mind as I worked on this presentation on the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Now, speaking about biblical justice to a crowd of MCC supporters feels a bit like singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to the Winnipeg Philharmonic Choir. You would not be here at this conference if you didn't already believe that the work MCC does to promote justice and peace in the world isn't important and isn't integral to our Christian faith. You probably already have a sense of what biblical justice is. I see my task here as reminding us all of what we believe to be true and as encouragement to continue living out of those convictions. I know that I need those reminders to motivate me to continue the hard work of following Jesus on the way of peace. So maybe you do too. I want to begin with a broad overview of what biblical justice is, and then focus on one text from the letter of James to see what it might teach us about seeking and living God's justice today. Justice is the kind of word whose meaning seems obvious until you begin to try to define it, like those stars that you see out of the corner of your eye but disappear when you try to look at them directly. For one thing, justice looks different depending on who you are and where you stand. It looks different for someone who had their car stolen than it looks for a single mother in prison. It looks different for an underpaid migrant worker than it does for someone whose daughter was murdered. I wonder how you would define justice. Often when people hear the word justice, they associate it with the legal system and punishment of offenders. Now, to be sure, bringing criminals to justice is part of it. And yet, the biblical understanding of justice is also much broader than that. I teach a course called Biblical Perspectives on Peace and Justice. When I asked my students, what is justice, in a course last year, here are some of the things they came up with. The word that stands out, words that stand out and are repeated most often are fair, right, and equality or equity. And those are all significant aspects of justice, but also not everything. When you start looking at the Bible's words for justice, you soon realize how vast the topic is and how central justice is in the Bible. Although they're sometimes translated in different ways, the various words for justice occur over 1,000 times. Now, I don't want to bog you down with Greek and Hebrew on a Saturday morning, but I do think it's helpful to know a few key words because it helps us to talk about what justice means in the Bible. The Hebrew word mishpat is the word usually translated justice. Another Hebrew word is tzedakah, or righteousness. In the New Testament, the Greek word dikaiosune can mean both justice and righteousness. In the Bible, the words righteousness and justice are closely related. Christopher Marshall, a New Testament scholar who's done significant work in the field of restorative justice, says this: the biblical language of righteousness refers broadly to doing, being, declaring, or bringing about what is right. When it is used in contexts that deal with conflict, coercion, or social distribution, it often has the force of justice or justice making. But in modern English usage, the terms righteousness and justice evoke very different connotations. Righteousness carries a sense of personal moral purity and religious piety, whereas justice relates to public judicial fairness and equality of rights. One belongs to the private moral, religious realm, the other to the public, political, legal realms. But in biblical usage, righteousness includes what we mean by justice. Righteousness includes what we mean by justice. Now, this is evident in passages, biblical passages, that use those words in tandem with virtually identical meanings. For example, Amos 5:24 says, "But let justice, mishpat, roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Isaiah 32, "See, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule with justice." I won't read the one from Psalms. So, according to Marshall, righteousness in the Bible incorporates the idea of doing justice, and doing justice in the Bible conveys the idea of righting what has gone wrong, or restoring things to conditions of rightness or righteousness. Justice in the Bible conveys the idea of righting what has gone wrong. The biblical concept of justice then includes both setting things right when a crime is committed and social justice, the fair distribution of resources and power. A condition of rightness might also be how we define the word shalom, another key biblical term related to justice. Shalom is a rich, iridescent word that is sometimes translated peace, but is so much more. I like the way Albert Wynn defines shalom. Shalom is to have health when disease is possible, safety when danger is possible, enough when deprivation is possible, life when death is possible. It's an all-encompassing state of well-being and right relationships, a condition of human and creational flourishing. It's the world as God intended it to be. As Eileen already said, shalom is impossible without justice, and justice is a necessary condition for shalom. Isaiah 32:16-18 says, "Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field." The effect of righteousness will be shalom, and the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. In summary, the work of doing justice is the work of setting things right in order that shalom can be restored. Justice in the Bible is thus integral to who God is. Because God desires and brings about shalom, God is inherently just and brings about justice. Psalm 146 paints a picture of what it means for God to do justice. Happy are those whose help is the God of Jacob, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoner free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the strangers. The Lord upholds the orphan and the widow, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. God makes judgments about what is right or just, what is necessary for everyone to experience shalom, and then acts to make that happen. In order to bring about justice, God both delivers the oppressed and stops the oppressor. As the psalm says it, God brings the way of the wicked to ruin. That means that God's justice is experienced as judgment by the oppressor, even as it is salvation for those whose needs are met. Sometimes people view God's actions of stopping the oppressor primarily in terms of punishment. At least that's what I hear from my students often. When people break God's laws, oppress the poor, turn to idols, God punishes them. To be sure, stories of God's retributive justice are present in the Bible, but the overwhelming emphasis in the Bible is not on punishment for its own sake, but on God setting things right. In other words, in the Bible, God's overall justice is primarily a restorative justice. It stops what is unjust in order to make shalom possible. Although the Bible is full of examples of how God sets things right, we're going to look briefly at just two of them. The two main salvation events in the Bible form the bedrock of our understanding of God as just, that is, as one who sets things right. The first is the foundational event in the Old Testament, God's delivery of God's people from slavery in Egypt. Exodus 2:23-25 says that the Israelites in Egypt groaned under their slavery and cried out. God heard their cries, and God remembered God's covenant with their ancestors. In this situation of oppression and injustice, God took notice and set in motion events that would set things right. A few things to notice about this story. The liberation of God's people from oppression was based on need, not merit. The people didn't do anything to earn God's justice. God noticed their suffering and acted on their behalf. Another thing, the timing of God's justice is sometimes hard to understand. Why did it take so long for God to respond to the suffering of God's children in Egypt? Also, we tend to see the 10 plagues as punishment on Pharaoh. What's perhaps more remarkable is that God gave Pharaoh so many chances to turn around, 10 times. God's justice is sometimes inexplicably patient. God works in strange and unexpected ways through surprising and unexpected people. Instead of using human armies, God pronounced judgment on Pharaoh by allowing creation to revert back to chaos. God used midwives who had the courage to stand up and say no to injustice, and an incompetent public speaker who 5 times made excuses when God called him to speak truth to power. God's deliverance of people from slavery is the central act of restorative justice in the Old Testament. God's second great act of setting things right was Jesus Christ. Jesus incarnated the restorative and often unconventional justice of God. At the beginning of his ministry, Jesus announced that these words from the prophet Isaiah were being fulfilled in him. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. He has sent me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the Lord's acceptable year. Matthew quotes a different Isaiah passage, and I won't read the whole thing, but key words, I will put my Spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory. Jesus announced that God's kingdom was breaking in, and in everything he said and did, Jesus made that reign a reality. In God's reign, shalom is restored. Relationships are mended, bodies are healed, sins are forgiven, and outsiders become insiders. In short, when God's kingdom comes, God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus embodied that reign of God and was God's ultimate way of setting things right. Interestingly, some of the same things that are evident about God's way of doing justice in the Exodus story are also evident in Jesus' work of setting things right. Jesus also released people from the bonds of slavery to sin, sickness, and death on the basis of need, not merit. Jesus didn't bring in God's reign all at once with might and thunder, or as John the Baptist warned of imminent judgment and said the coming one would burn the chaff with fire. Jesus said, let the weeds grow along with the wheat. He talked about the coming kingdom as a seed growing secretly at night and about a tiny mustard seed growing into a huge tree. Although God's reign of peace and justice is already something to be tasted and touched, its full arrival requires patience. And Jesus too worked in strange and unexpected ways through surprising and unexpected people. Among his followers were an impulsive fisherman, a wealthy wife of Herod's chief financial officer, a tax collector, and a woman freed from demons. Most strange of all, Jesus allowed himself to be killed rather than call down fire upon his enemies or invoke God's armies to save him. In dying for the sins of the world, Jesus revealed how strange God's justice is. And in the most upside-down act of all, God raised Jesus from the dead, showing that God always triumphs over evil. By raising Jesus from the dead, God turned something that humans intended for evil into a means of setting things right. There are, of course, many more stories in the Bible of God putting a stop to injustice and setting things right. I've named the Bible's two key salvation events, the Exodus and the coming of Jesus Christ, to show that restoring shalom and doing justice lie at the heart of who God is. God is a God who sets things right. The Bible calls people to do justice. Because God is just, to love and serve God means to participate in God's right-making activity. In both the Old and the New Testament, God calls forth a people who will participate in God's work of restoring the world to shalom. This is evident in both the great acts of salvation we talked about. When God liberated Israel from Egypt, from slavery in Egypt, God didn't just set them free from something, they were also freed for something. They were set free to worship and serve God and to be a light to the nations. In the wilderness of Mount Sinai, God made a covenant with God's people and gave them laws to help them live in right relationship with each other and with God. Christians today often see the laws of the Old Testament as antiquated, strange, and irrelevant. It's true that many of the commandments are hard to understand. We live in such a different culture and time. But despite the radically different assumptions, it's striking how God's instructions for community life are oriented toward justice, especially for the poor and powerless. For example, there are prohibitions against extracting interest from the poor and keeping a cloak overnight as security for a loan. When a crime is committed, the Old Testament often operates on the principles of restorative rather than retributive justice. That is, the goal is not punishment of the wrongdoer, but restitution and the restoration of relationships within the community. The year of Jubilee was a year of release, debt release, release from slavery, return of land. In other words, every 50 years, God's people were to press the reset button and restore things to their original state. The motivation for all this was that they were to remember that they were slaves in Egypt, and God had delivered them. Therefore, they should treat others with justice and compassion as well. Of course, the people of God were not faithful to the covenant and failed miserably to live justly. We see this in the historical writings, which depict the kings and powerful elite oppressing the poor. Through the prophets, God repeatedly reminds God's people to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with their God. The following is just a sample of the many prophetic calls for justice for the oppressed. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Thus says the Lord, act with justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor anyone who has been robbed. And do no wrong or violence to the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place. The Psalms and wisdom literature also urge justice for the poor. Give justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. We find the same persistent call to participate in God's right-making activity in the New Testament. Jesus came as God's agent of liberation and gathered around him disciples who were compelled by his good news of God's kingdom breaking in and whose lives were changed because of it. Like God in the Old Testament, when Jesus met people in need, he did not only liberate them from something, he also liberated them for something. Jesus set people free from the entangling snares of sin, sickness, demons, and wealth, and set them free to follow him, to join with him in making God's reign a reality on earth as it is in heaven. He taught his disciples to trust God rather than worry about their material well-being, to hold loosely to their possessions, and to give generously to those in need. This wasn't a call for individual charity, though Jesus welcomed that too, but a radical reorientation of community toward God's priorities of enough for all. He told his disciples that if while they were worshiping God, they remembered that someone had something against them, they should immediately go seek reconciliation. In other words, broken relationships impede our relationship with God and require urgent attention. Jesus told a parable about a rich man who lived extravagantly for his own pleasure and ignored the desperately poor one sitting at his door. But Jesus also dined with a rich tax collector who subsequently made restitution to those whom he had cheated. When people encountered Jesus, they were compelled to make things right with their neighbors. Jesus' way of seeking God's justice and shalom for all was upside down, and he called his followers to emulate him in this strange, countercultural kingdom living. Rather than retaliating against oppressive, they were to engage in creative, nonviolent acts of loving the enemy. Instead of striving for status, Jesus taught them to serve others. Instead of creating boundaries between in and out, Jesus called his followers to welcome everyone to the table, the least and the lost and the leftovers. And he modeled it by eating and drinking with everyone. In all of this, Jesus lived out God's way of making things right, of restoring the world to God's original intention of shalom. He invited them to imagine what the world would look like if God's will really were done on earth as it is in heaven, and to live as if that were so. Now, this is all something you no doubt already believe in if you're a supporter of MCC. How does that play out in real life? How did the church in the first century work at living out the biblical vision of God, setting things right, and of Jesus' call to join in that work? Well, much like we do today, sometimes with faithfulness and imagination, sometimes with spectacular failure. Because my head is currently in James a lot, I want to look at one example from that letter. It's a situation of injustice in which social structures and cultural values surrounding wealth and power were negatively impacting the way this community of Jesus followers were treating the poor and powerless. James writes to the church to remind them of who they are and to call them to live in a way that aligns with the justice of God. Let me begin by giving you some context. First of all, with respect to everything I've said so far, both James and his church would believe all those things too. His audience consisted mostly of Jews who believed that Jesus was God's promised Messiah and were deeply steeped in the Hebrew scriptures. They knew God to be a God who desires justice because it was their ancestors who were liberated from slavery in Egypt. They strove to be faithful to the covenant by following God's laws and heeding the words of the prophets. Although James doesn't explicitly quote Jesus, his letter echoes Jesus' teachings all over the place, especially those in the Sermon on the Mount. And we don't have time to look at all of them now. Although James's church no doubt wanted to follow Jesus, they didn't always succeed. I think we tend to read the letter of James as though addressed to individual Christians. That is, James tells me how I should live out my faith in daily life. But it's important to remember that the letter was addressed to the scattered church and written to give the church guidance on how to live faithfully as followers of Jesus the Messiah in their life together. It's evident when one reads this letter that the churches James is addressing are undergoing trials of various sorts. And James is encouraging them not to give up, but to live faithfully in the midst of them. It seems like the suffering they're experiencing is, at least in good measure, socioeconomic in nature. In fact, they're justice issues. Issues of inequality, oppression, lack of shalom. James 2:6-7. Isn't it the rich who oppress you, drag you into court, blaspheme the good name invoked over you? And in 5:1-6, James laces into rich landowners. The thing is, the church to which James is writing is both a victim of injustice and at the very same time perpetrating injustice. That's often how it is, even today, isn't it? A person or a group of people can be on the receiving end of unjust actions while also treating them unjustly. So let's look at just such a scenario in James and see what we can learn from it. I'm going to read James 2, verse 1-9 from the New Revised Standard Version. My brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one who is poor you say, go stand over there or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters. Has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. I think when we read this text today, we often envision a modern church worship setting with pews or chairs and rows facing a pulpit. Ushers in the foyer are greeting someone who wears designer clothes and drives a Porsche, and then trying to figure out what to do with the homeless person who just walked in without shoes and smelling kind of funky. But let's think about it in the first century context. Jewish followers of Jesus have gathered in the local synagogue, probably around a meal. The two people who come in, one dressed in rags and the other one with fine clothes and jewelry, might be visitors or regular attenders. There's some strong cultural dynamics at work here involving honor and patronage. In ancient societies, people with wealth and power would often give financial support to people of lower status in exchange for honor, recognition, special favors. In a meal setting, the host would be responsible for making sure the rich patron would get the best seat in the house, close to the host, and thereby receive the honor due him. Those lower on the social ladder would be told to stand further away with the slaves, maybe, or to sit at the feet of the more important guests reclining at the table. This is the way society worked, and everyone accepted it. It was not, however, to be this way in the new community of Jesus followers, a community that was to embody God's justice and shalom, a community of disciples in whom there was neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, to quote from Paul. Jesus' kingdom parables and his countercultural meals with tax collectors and other riffraff demonstrated that strict reciprocity and honor codes that privileged the wealthy were not the way the system worked in God's reign. James writes this letter to followers of Jesus who need to be reminded of that. Even though many or most of them were poor themselves, the pull to cater to the wealthy and powerful perhaps to benefit from their financial patronage, was strong. The church needed reminding that people should not be treated differently because of their social class, their appearance, their status, their wealth. Well, why not, you might ask? At least I think James's readers might ask that. If this rich person comes into their assembly and is a potential benefactor who could help the church be more secure, why not treat him with a little more respect? James gives 3 reasons. 1, they would not be acting like God acts. God has chosen the poor to be heirs of the kingdom, says James, something also Jesus also promised when he said, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." God will lift up the poor and deliver them because that is who God is and that is how God acts. So why are they who are servants of God and the Lord Jesus Christ dishonoring the poor? Secondly, the way they're favoring the well-dressed person and dishonoring the poor is illogical. It's the rich who are oppressing them and dragging them into court. To suck up to someone in that social class is not only wrong, it doesn't make any sense. Thirdly, and climactically, they should not discriminate against the poor and favor the rich because it's contrary to what the scriptures say is God's will. James quotes Leviticus 19, verse 18 to prove his point. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, why this particular Old Testament verse? Well, just a few verses before, Leviticus 19:15 says this, you shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. The church's partiality to the well-dressed man reminds James of this verse in Leviticus where God commands them not to defer to the great, but to make just judgments. And this leads him to God's command to love your neighbor as yourself. I want to say more about loving one's neighbor in a bit. But first, let me highlight something in this text which seems obvious once you think about it, but maybe not so obvious on first reading. The story is about an egregiously wealthy man and a wretchedly poor man, 2 people about as far apart on the social economic spectrum as one could get. But this story is not primarily a critique of wealth, even though James is blistering in his condemnation of the rich elsewhere. It's not primarily an exhortation to feed and clothe the poor, even though James does call his readers to do that elsewhere. The object of James' critique is the host's behavior and the church's. The encounter in 2:1-9 is about the church and the host succumbing to the pressure to treat some people better than others because of how it might benefit them. It's about unequal power dynamics. This is what is so unjust in this scenario. As James says, they have made distinctions among themselves and become judges with evil thoughts. In this text, James is calling the church to live by the alternative honor system of Jesus, the one whom they call their glorious Lord and Messiah, and who relinquished his glory to become human. James is calling the church to treat people with equity and fairness, to not discriminate against some and privilege others because of how much money they do or don't have. But it's even more than that. If the rich person in the story was indeed a potential benefactor of the church, willing to give financial support to this fledgling group of Messiah followers, James is urging them to engage in even riskier behavior than treating individuals equally. He's calling for active resistance against the whole system of patronage, which was inherently discriminatory. Such an act of protest ran the risk of impoverishing the community further if the benefactor perceived their refusal to privilege him as dishonoring him. He might retaliate against them by withdrawing any benefits he could bestow on them. In other words, in the scenario James envisions, he is not only exhorting the church to be nice to the poor, but calling the church to take the risk of publicly questioning deeply embedded cultural values, of resisting long-standing structures of injustice that favor some over others. He's calling on them not to participate in systems of injustice, but to live in alignment with God's right-making activities, demonstrated so powerfully in Jesus, their Messiah. Although James does not explicitly name this as an example of injustice, it seems to be just that. So what does it mean in this particular situation to emulate Jesus' way of justice and participate in God's right-making activity? I want to come back to something I said earlier, something which seems incredibly simple and yet is incredibly difficult. What it means for the church to act with justice in this situation is simply to love your neighbor as yourself. It's something that James's church knew from the scriptures. It's something Jesus himself said more than once. It's something that Paul quotes in both Romans and Galatians. James says that loving your neighbor as yourself fulfills the royal law, that is, the law of God's kingdom. Since Jesus ushered in this kingdom in his ministry, then to love one's neighbor means to love as Jesus loved, and to take seriously what Jesus said about loving one's neighbor. According to Jesus, a neighbor includes not only the person who lives next door, who has similar lifestyles, beliefs, and socioeconomic background, and who's easy to love, but also the other, the foreigner, the despised, the despicable, even the enemy. People tend to think that to love someone means to have warm, fuzzy feelings for them. But I don't think that's actually what Jesus meant when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. To love people on Jesus' terms means to choose to act for the well-being of the other, whether you feel like it or not. It means to take concrete steps toward right relationships, to choose mercy and compassion over judgment and favoritism. In other words, loving your neighbor does not mean you have to be friends with your neighbor or even like your neighbor. To love our neighbors is to provide for their shalom, their well-being, with as much energy and determination and commitment as we would for our own children, our own parents, our own selves. To use the language of justice that I used earlier, to love our neighbors as ourselves is to work at making things right. That is actually very hard work. It's one thing to work for the well-being of the other when you like that person. It's quite something else to do that when the other is someone you feel doesn't deserve it, or when that goes against what everyone else is doing, or when it requires courage to stand against injustice. During the pandemic, I've noticed that the language of loving your neighbor has been used quite a bit. We wear masks as a way of loving our neighbors because we don't want to unintentionally pass the virus on. We get vaccines so that the most vulnerable in our society are less exposed to this deadly virus. That is all true, and the things that we do for the well-being of the neighbor are not insignificant. But those are fairly easy ways to love our neighbors. I think Jesus and James are calling us to something more difficult than that. To love our neighbors as ourselves is to do justice, to participate with God in restoring the world to shalom, to follow Jesus' way of making things right. For the Christians in James's church, it meant acting for the well-being of the person who looked and was insignificant. It meant not just welcoming the least and the lost to the table, but seating them right next to the host and giving them the best cut of meat and the biggest piece of pie. It meant resisting deeply ingrained habits of privileging some over others on the basis of wealth, status, education, etc. It meant overturning social structures and cultural values that everyone just accepted. It meant doing the hard work of setting things right when society tells you that the way things are just fine. The work of MCC is all about loving our neighbors as ourselves. It encompasses feeding the hungry, making room at the table for those often shoved aside, and changing structures and systems of injustice. As such, the work that MCC does participates in God's work of restoring the world to shalom and setting things right. It's not always easy work. Like James's church, I think we also find it hard to resist cultural and social norms that privilege some voices over others. Most of us would immediately frown on the blatant favoritism that James criticizes in 2:1-9. But in practice, the church and its institutions often fail to make distinctions on the basis of outward appearance, wealth, or status. It's hard not to let the voices with the biggest bank accounts set the agenda. It takes courage to give the person with absolutely zero economic, social, or political clout an equal voice at the table. Because the example James gives is about privileged treatment of a richly dressed man, it might be tempting to limit our thinking about discrimination to issues of wealth and to the way individuals treat each other. What James is condemning, however, is much broader and has wider implications. First, discrimination against some and preferential treatment of others in the church and society today is based not only on economic status, but also on the color of someone's skin, on gender, age, sexuality, level of education, and occupation, to name only a few. Secondly, these signs are larger than preferential treatment of individuals by individuals. Discrimination is systemic and structural, deeply embedded in political, economic, social, and yes, even religious institutions. It's persistent because it is often subtle and is often overlooked by people of privilege who benefit from it. Followers of Jesus who want to take seriously James's admonition in 2:1-9 not to show favoritism will take seriously the systemic nature of discrimination in the church, in addition to the way it infects individuals in matters of wealth and poverty. In North America today, it's not hard to find examples of systemic social discrimination. Rich people receive preferential treatment at banks, benefit from better medical care, have access to better schools. In the last couple of years, we've witnessed demonstrations across Canada and the US protesting police violence against Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. Stories of harassment and inequitable treatment of people on the basis of outward appearance are heartbreaking and ubiquitous. That the criminal justice system discriminates against Black, Indigenous, and people of color is evident in the disproportionate number of people from those populations in the prison system. But one might argue, this is society, not the church. Unfortunately, the church also participates in systemic injustice, often ignorant to the way in which long-standing practices favor some and hurt others. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours in North America. Although churches are more diverse than in the 1960s, racial discrimination is still deeply embedded in the church today, to name only one example. Apathy, ignorance, cowardice, or simply unwillingness to become advocates for and allies of victims of injustice make the church complicit in the kind of favoritism of which James is so critical. I began this talk by reflecting on what was happening on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. My questions remain. What do calls for justice mean in the context of Canada's injustices against Indigenous peoples for centuries? What is the role of the church, which has historically participated in and benefited from such injustice? What does it mean to love our Indigenous neighbours as ourselves? That is, to work actively for the well-being of the other. What does it mean to stand against systems of racism and structures that privilege some people over others? What does it mean to make things right in cases where land has been unjustly taken from its original owners? How can and does MCC participate in God's justice, restoring dignity and shalom to all people? Of course, this is only one of many ways in which our world is hurting and broken. There are many questions that arise about the hard work of loving our neighbors in an unjust world. To name only one more, what if our neighbor's creation? What does it mean to practice restorative justice when the victim of our greed and privilege is the non-human creation? How does giving our Indigenous neighbors an equal voice at the table lead us ever deeper into Jesus' way of love and peacemaking in restoring creation to its goodness? There are so many ways that MCC is already participating in God's work of restoring the world to God's intentions of shalom and justice for all. Many churches and individuals are striving to become sanctuaries of justice, and are working hard for change. Nevertheless, the road to justice for all is long, and we have miles to go before we sleep. Where do we find hope and courage and wisdom for this long road? We remember to whom we belong, namely God, and why we are walking this road in the first place. We do this hard work of loving our neighbors and striving for justice because we love and serve a God who sets people free, who sets us free, and who is committed to restoring the world to shalom. We do this work because we love Jesus, who walked the road before us and invited us to join him in God's ministry of reconciliation. We do this work because the Spirit blows mightily among us, inspiring us to live already now in the imagination of God's reign of justice and joy. We do this work because we have hope and trust that our labor is not in vain, and that God will use our humble offerings to make all things new. May it be so.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much for the reminders and the challenges and walking us through the biblical view of justice. That was impressive. You usually do that like in a semester, I'm assuming. So well done. Well done.
It was a challenge, let me tell you.
So I remind us all, we have a few minutes here to chat with Sheila. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to send them to the moderator. I have one to start, Sheila. We participate in a variety of reconciliation circles here in Saskatchewan. And one of the things we're learning is that we need to make, the TRC calls to action, we need to make them personal. We need to create our personal reconciliation story. And I know that goes a little bit against sort of the communal view of the James text, but let's make it like a church view, right? What is our church commitment to reconciliation? Because as you noted, there's just a ton of things that we could be working on. And so what do we work on? And so my question for you, Sheila, is you've been spending a lot of time with James. And I'm just curious how you're feeling convicted as a person, as a member of a congregation in these days. What comes to top of mind? How are you being convicted these days by James?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I have a long list. I mean, and your question, Eileen, goes beyond just questions of restorative justice. So let's see. Okay, I'm going to rattle off a whole bunch of. So one of the things that I'm convinced is central to James is living with integrity. And so James uses the word perfect a number of times, which is toxic to people who are perfectionists like me. But he's talking about wholeness and integrity. And when I read James, the whole letter is about living with integrity. So letting what we believe, like if we believe that God is a God of justice and we're called to participate in this, then to actually live that way. If we say something, then we should show it in our actions. If we hear something, it needs to come out in the way we live. So integrity. Another way that James talks a lot about wisdom. I think we need a lot of wisdom to live in these very complicated and challenging times. James says, if anyone is lacking in wisdom, ask for it. And God, who is gracious and generous and ungrudging, will give wisdom. So I pray for wisdom. James talks a lot about, I'm teaching a course called James and the Sermon on the Mount right now. So last class, Thursday, we talked about James' speech and anger, because there's a lot in James about how we speak. I'm trying to watch the way that I speak, because I think it's really easy to, especially when we're passionate about injustices and we get angry about them, to lash out, to be ungracious, and to really cause harm, to do violence with the way we speak. So one of my challenges, even as I worked on that class, was to watch how I speak. And James talks a lot about judging. This is the last one, so I'm not going to go on and on here. James talks a lot about judging. I find myself judging people really, really easily. And I think that's easier to do on a personal level. It's easy to do in the church. It's easy to do when we're working with justice. I'm trying not to judge so much. So that is just a sample of how James is challenging me.
Thanks, Sheila. I have a question here that actually follows up on just what you said. So the question is, can you talk about the potential tension between the strong biblical call to justice and the biblical call to remain in community, even with some Christians who view justice as of lesser importance? So maybe just follow on those thoughts. The tension between the strong biblical call to justice and the biblical call to remain in community.
Yeah. It is a tension, isn't it? Yep. Yeah. Mennonites are really good at, we don't agree with somebody, just leave or kick them out. I mean, it is a tension, and I'm going to draw on James here. And I think it must have been a tension in James's church too, because there's this persistent, he calls them brothers and sisters. Well, in the Greek it's brothers, but he calls them brothers and sisters throughout. Our beloved, he calls them beloved, and yet he's so sort of unrelenting about how they need to shape up and live with integrity and be just. And so he holds those two together. And I think I'll just maybe repeat what I said. I think he also talks at the end of the letter about confessing our sins to each other and holding each other accountable and praying for each other. And if somebody has lost their way, bring that person back. I think he challenges us to keep talking to each other and to challenge each other, but to do so in a way that doesn't let go, that wants to stay in relationship. I mean, he has hard words for the church. He calls them like adulterers and says you're killing each other. And yet he calls them brothers and sisters, my beloved. So I think it's hard. It is a challenge, but I think James wants us to do that and to pray for wisdom when we do it. Am I answering your question?
I think so, yeah. Okay, here's one more. It says, my version of James 2:1 asks, in short, how can you claim to have faith in Jesus Christ and favor some over others? Curious about that linkage between favoritism and perhaps a lack of faith. Any thoughts?
So can you read it one more time?
Yes. My version of James 2:1 asks, in short, how can you claim to have faith in Jesus Christ and favor some over others? Curious about that linkage between favoritism and perhaps a lack of faith. Any thoughts?
Favoritism and a lack of faith?
Yeah, like, is it a lack of faith that makes them show favoritism to some?
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, I don't know. This is maybe coming around it from a back end, but a couple of things come to mind. So James is the master of rhetorical questions. So it's a rhetorical, like really, you say you have faith in Jesus, but you're acting like this. Really? So I think he's not so much questioning their faith, although maybe they do have weak faith. But that leads me to something else. what the word faith is. So often, I mean, the word faith can mean believing something. So like even the demons believe. It can mean to trust. It can mean to be faithful, to be loyal. And I think all of that is tied up in when James talks about faith. But in James, faith is less about believing with one's head than putting your whole body into it. So when he says, like, if you're really showing favoritism and yet it has to do with integrity. You say that you are loyal to Jesus the Messiah. But you're not acting that way. So I don't know if that's answering the person's question, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Okay, this is the last one, and it's a really big one. But maybe just if you just have a few thoughts about it. So how does the church reconcile itself to a secular political process in truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? So what is, I don't want to interpret the question, but how does the church reconcile itself?
Interpret the question for me.
Sorry, the question is, how does the church reconcile itself to a secular political process in truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples?
Do you want to interpret the question for me?
Well, I think it's just something about, the church has its own calling, its own teachings, but we've also been called to this thing that we live in this social political context, and we've been called to participate in this thing. Like, where are the linkages between those two things?
Yeah. That question seems to assume that they're at odds with each other. And sometimes, I mean, sometimes they are. It's not like our governments. But I think, the church needs to be a leader in seeking truth and reconciliation, and I think we haven't always been, and I think it's actually kind of shameful that our governments and our political systems are doing more for truth and reconciliation than the churches sometimes. So sometimes they are at odds sometimes, and that's where we need each other to think, okay, like, what does this mean to be the church? What does it mean to do justice God's way? What does it mean to follow the path of justice of Jesus? But that doesn't necessarily need to be at odds with what the political system is. In fact, sometimes I think we can work together. And the church should call the powers to live justly, and if the government is calling us to live more justly, well, then we're not listening to Jesus enough, because Jesus is calling us to justice even more strongly than our government is. So they are at odds. I think it requires wisdom, discernment, but they're not necessarily at odds.
Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, lots of good things to think about. Thank you so much, Sheila, for your time and your deep dedication to biblical teaching. We're very grateful for your time this morning, and it sets us on a good path for our day. Yes.
Can I say thank you for having me? It's been nice to be here. I can't see you all on my screen, but it's an honor to be asked to speak to you. So thank you. I'm a big fan of MCC. So yay.
Well, thanks, Sheila, and thanks for giving us a really good challenge for today and for the days to come. And now, just before I send you all back to Denise, we have a slideshow which highlights MCC's experiential learning opportunities here in Saskatchewan. So that should be showing up momentarily. It's coming, folks. Don't worry, it's coming.
Or we could act it out, Eileen. Well,
I don't think I have the script. The meeting host is telling me that it's coming, so I'm going to just choose to be patient for just a little bit here.
Yeah, no, of course.
And maybe while we're waiting, Denise, if you had instruction. Oh, here it comes.
We're going. Okay.
MCC is a nonprofit organization that works with partners in over 50 countries with humanitarian relief, development, and peace-building projects. Locally, we work with partners in Saskatchewan towards reconciliation and Indigenous land justice, in restorative justice projects, through community development, and offering migration and resettlement support through private refugee sponsorship. Based on the work of our partners, MCC has also made available learning experiences and workshops based on anti-oppressive theory that explore the root causes that make people vulnerable and marginalized. The following are some opportunities you can engage in through MCC resources and staff. The Kairos Blanket exercise is an interactive and experiential teaching tool that explores the historic and contemporary relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the land we now know as Canada. Through this exercise, root causes of injustice and racism are explored. Sharing circles following the exercise promote action and advocacy on a local level. Reserve 107 is a film that delves into the Indigenous rights and title to the land in a rural area near Laird, Saskatchewan. It highlights one experience of Indigenous and settler communities coming together to advocate for the redress of historical harms. Reconcile Everyday Conversations is an MCC Saskatchewan podcast that explores the meaning of reconciliation from various perspectives, both settler and Indigenous. It invites listeners to explore how they might become more involved in reconciliation within their communities. An available study guide can assist small groups to delve deeper into the work of reconciliation. The Doctrine of Discovery Learning Tour is a self-guided walk around sites in Saskatoon that were impacted by the Doctrine of Discovery, the legal framework that shaped European colonial rule. The MCC materials provided for this walk help participants unpack the legacy and influence of this doctrine. Forced to Flee is a simulation of a refugee experience. It was developed by the Canadian Food Grains Bank as an exercise that invites participants to work together to make difficult decisions to maintain their supply of food, money, and health while securing their future post-conflict. This activity includes discussion questions, real-life stories, and facts on conflict and migration. Bridging Borders is a TV series that explores refugees' resilience as it spotlights the real-life relationships created by MCC's private refugee sponsorship program in Saskatchewan. Your community group, church, or workplace can partner with MCC to support and sponsor a refugee family to come to Canada. Our community development program utilizes volunteers to provide a safe and welcoming place for kids in Meadow Green. The program builds partnerships with schools, businesses, churches, and individuals to provide recreational and skill-building programming and to create dialogue around issues like racism and bullying. Twice a year, we offer a conflict transformation course, which allows people to explore different avenues of peace building through through local community experts. MCC proudly supports and promotes the work of our restorative justice partners like COSA South Saskatchewan, Parkland Restorative Justice, and the Micah Mission. All of these organizations are volunteer-based and provide amazing opportunities to work towards safer communities. You Got Booked is an interactive learning experience that looks at the interplay of identity, poverty, and incarceration. Participants travel around a board game trying to build assets and avoid prison. By participating in this tool, people learn how different intersections of identity lead to varied experiences of justice. Finally, Training Active Bystanders uses a restorative justice framework to teach participants how to best intervene when they witness to abusive, isolating, or stigmatizing behavior. The staff in Saskatoon from MCC Saskatchewan have a wide range of passion and expertise, and we're eager to share this with your church, your school, or at your community event. Contact us to explore these options further.